Hello everybody and welcome back to Law and Court Cases, and in today's video we're going to be talking about a serial killer who killed at least 14 people and committed a multitude more of dangerous crimes. His obsession with Satanism became a moniker for him, even telling a few of his victims to swear their love to Satan or to swear on Satan. Today I am talking about Richard Ramirez, better known as the Night Stalker. So without further ado, let's get into the video. Richard Ramirez was born on February 29, 1960 in El Paso, Texas, to immigrant parents Mercedes and Julian Ramirez. He was their fifth child. Richard's father, a former police officer turned labourer, developed an alcohol problem and became physically abusive to both his wife and his children. It's reported that Ramirez sustained multiple injuries to the head as a child, the most prominent being when he was knocked unconscious by a swing at the age of 5. It was after this blow to the head that Ramirez started experiencing epileptic seizures. When Richard was a teenager, he began to spend a lot of time with his cousin Miguel. Miguel had returned from the war in Vietnam, where he admitted to Richard that he had performed various violent war crimes against Vietnamese women whilst he was away. He confessed to Richard that he raped, murdered, and decapitated multiple women. Richard was reportedly fascinated by this, rather than fearful. The two smoked marijuana together, something Richard had been doing from the age of 10, and when Richard was just 13, he witnessed Miguel murder his own wife. When it went to court, he was deemed not guilty by reason of insanity, being declared as such due to his PTSD, and only served a 4-year prison sentence. Shortly after the violent crime, Richard moved in with his older sister Ruth and her husband Roberto, a profound peeping Tom who recruited Richard to join him on his late-night voyeurisms. By the age of just 14, he had branched out further than just using marijuana and was taking LSD frequently. After his cousin Miguel's release from prison, the two began to bond once again over drugs and alcohol, falling deeper down the dark rabbit hole. That it is around this time that Richard became fascinated with Satanism and the occult. Ramirez said that during his teen years, he began to have disturbing sexual fantasies and fantasizing about murder. He would fantasize about forced bondage, rape, murder, and mutilation. Ramirez used to work at a Holiday Inn, where he committed a multitude of violent acts using a master key that he had stolen to gain access to the rooms in the hotel. He molested 2 children in an elevator, a crime for which he was not prosecuted, but he also attempted to rape a female patron using the master key to enter her room. Luckily, the woman's husband was able to stop the attack, beating Ramirez before the hotel fired him. Although charges were brought against him, they were later dropped, as the couple lived out of state and did not want to return to Texas for the trial. He then proceeded to drop out of high school in the 9th grade. In 1982, when Richard was just 22, he once again decided to experiment further with drugs, trying cocaine. This would eventually become his drug of choice. This was also around the time that Richard moved and settled in California. Living a nomadic lifestyle, Richard would burgle and steal to sustain his drug habit. He would also only travel around California both before and during his crime spree, only ending it all when he was captured. Now moving on to the killings. On April 10th of 1984, May Long, age 9, was murdered by Ramirez in the basement of his apartment building in San Francisco. He lured her into the basement with the promise of helping her find a missing $1 bill. Instead, young May was beaten, strangled and murdered before being raped by Ramirez. The crime was linked to him in 2009 due to DNA evidence found at the scene of the crime. On June 28th of the same year, Richard murdered Jenny Viscow in her apartment in LA. She had been stabbed repeatedly in the head, neck and chest while asleep in her bed, and her throat was slashed. It was slashed so deeply that she was nearly decapitated. Richard's DNA was found at the scene on a mesh screen that he'd removed from the window in order to gain access to her apartment. This would be identified as a pattern of behaviour of the Night Stalker, who'd break in and steal items from the homes either before or after committing murders. These items would then be pawned to earn money to fund his drug habit and to pay his rent. 9 months later, Ramirez was killing again. Upon returning home, 22-year-old Maria Hernandez was confronted by Richard outside of the garage of her Rosemead home. He raised his gun at Hernandez, but she raised her hands in front of her face. In her hands was a set of keys. When Richard shot at Maria, it grazed off the car keys she was holding before he knocked her to the ground. She played dead and Ramirez entered her home. She survived this attack. Her roommate, 34-year-old Dale Okazaki, would not be so lucky. Dale was in the kitchen when she heard the gunshot, and she ducked behind the kitchen counter when Ramirez entered the home. Unfortunately, Richard could see Dale as her hands were sat on top of the counter, so he waited for her on the other side of the kitchen counter. Once she lifted her head to see if Richard was still around, he shot her once in the forehead, killing her instantly. He used a .22 caliber gun. However, Ramirez was not done killing that night, because within an hour of the previous attack, Ramirez had stopped and pulled 30-year-old Xylin Yu from her car in Monterey Park and shot her twice and left her for dead. It is reported that her last words were, "Help me, help me." Very sadly, she was pronounced dead upon arrival at the hospital. Detectives were able to get a partial description of Richard from surviving victim Maria Hernandez and other eyewitnesses. He was described as curly-haired, light-skinned Hispanic or white, with bulging eyes and rotten teeth. On March 24th of 1984, at approximately 2 a.m., the Night Stalker struck again, entering the home of 64-year-old Vincent Charles Azara and his 44-year-old wife Maxine. Upon entering, Richard found Vincent asleep on the sofa, where he approached him and shot him in the head, killing him instantly. The sound of the gunshot awoke Maxine, and he continued on to attack her next. He bound her hands and had her show him where any of the valuables were around the property. Whilst in another room, Maxine was able to free herself from her restraints and retrieve a handgun that the couple owned. She turned the gun on Ramirez and pulled the trigger. Unfortunately, the weapon was not loaded. Enraged and shaken, Richard proceeded to shoot Maxine 3 times, ending her life. However, Richard was not finished yet. He then proceeded to obtain a knife from the kitchen, using it to mutilate her body and even cut out her eyes that he kept in a jewellery box as a grotesque souvenir. These were held until his arrest. He also attempted to have sex with Maxine after death, but he could not do so. It was at the Zazara home that investigators found a key piece of evidence linking Ramirez to the crime. Preserved in the dirt outside of the house was a footprint of an Avia shoe, which would later be cast. They were also able to determine that the shell casings found at the scene were a match to the previous murder. With this information, they determined that a serial killer was at large. On May 14th of 1985, Ramirez returned to Monterey Park. He entered the home of 66-year-old Bill Doy and his disabled wife, 56-year-old Lillian Doy. Upon finding Ramirez inside his home, Bill reached for his own handgun, but unfortunately the Night Stalker was quicker, shooting the man in the face before beating him. He would later go on to die in hospital as a result of his injuries. Ramirez entered the room where Lillian was, and using thumb cuffs, he held her hands together. He proceeded to rape her before ransacking the home for items and valuables before leaving. Bill Doy was able to call 911 after regaining a brief moment of consciousness. It's possible that this action was what saved Lillian's life. Just 2 weeks later, on May 29th, Ramirez drove a stolen car to Monrovia and stopped at the house of Mabel Marbell, age 83, and her disabled sister, 81-year-old Florence Nettie Lang. Searching the house, he found a hammer in the kitchen. He then bludgeoned and bound Lang in her bedroom, then bound and bludgeoned Bell before using an electrical cord to shock the woman. After raping Lang, he used Bell's lipstick to draw a satanic pentagram symbol on her thigh, as well as on the walls of both bedrooms. The women were not found until 2 days later, although they were both alive but comatose and critically injured. Sadly, Bell died in the hospital from her injuries on July 15th, and Lang died in August. The next day, Ramirez drove the same car to Burbank and snuck into the house of 42-year-old Carol Kyle. Holding them at gunpoint, he bound Kyle and her 11-year-old son with handcuffs before ransacking the home. He released Kyle to direct him to where the family valuables were. He then raped her repeatedly. Ramirez also repeatedly ordered her not to look at him, telling her at one point that he would cut her eyes out, just like he did to Maxine Zazara. He fled the scene after retrieving the child from the closet and binding the two together again with handcuffs. On the night of July 2nd of 1985, Ramirez was driving a stolen car in Arcadia and randomly selected the home of 75-year-old Mary Louise Cannon, a widowed grandmother. After quietly entering Cannon's home, he found her asleep in her bedroom. He bludgeoned her into an unconscious state with a lamp before stabbing her to death using a 10-inch butcher knife from her kitchen. Despite being dead already, Ramirez repeatedly stabbed Cannon's body. Just 3 nights later, Ramirez broke into a home in Sierra Madre and bludgeoned 16-year-old Whitney Bennett with a tire iron as she slept in her bedroom. After searching in vain for a knife in the kitchen, Ramirez tried to strangle the girl with a telephone cord. He stated that as he was strangling her, he started to see electrical sparks emanating from the cord, and when the victim began to breathe again, he fled the house, believing that Jesus Christ had intervened to save her. Bennett survived the attack, but despite this, she needed 478 stitches into her head to close up the laceration that he had caused. On July 7th, Ramirez burglarized the home of 60-year-old Joyce Lucille Nelson in Monterey Park. Upon entering the house, he found her asleep on the living room couch. He then beat her to death before grotesquely stomping on her face repeatedly. A shoe print from an Avia sneaker was left imprinted on her face. After cruising 2 other neighbourhoods, he returned to Monterey Park and chose the home of Sophie Dickman, age 63. Ramirez assaulted and handcuffed Dickman at gunpoint, attempting to rape her and stole her jewellery. When she swore to him that he had taken everything of value, he told her to swear on Satan, something he would say multiple times to many other victims. 2 weeks later, on July 20th, Ramirez purchased a machete before driving a stolen Toyota to Glendale. He chose the home of 66-year-old Layla Needing and her husband, 68-year-old Maxon Needing. He burst into the sleeping couple's bedroom and hacked them with the machete. He then killed them both by shooting them in the head with a .22 caliber handgun. Despite being dead, he further mutilated their bodies with the machete before robbing the house of valuables. After quickly retrieving the stolen items, Ramirez drove to Sun Valley, LA, and broke into the home of the Kovanath family. I really apologise if I butchered the pronunciation of that surname. He shot the sleeping 32-year-old Chan Rong Kovanath in the head with the same .22 caliber handgun, killing him instantly. He then repeatedly raped and beat 32-year-old Somkin Kovanath. Whilst in the home, he also bound the couple's 8-year-old son before dragging Somkin around the house to reveal the locations of any valuable items, which he then proceeded to steal. During his assault, he demanded that she swear on Satan that she was not hiding any money from him. On August 6th of 1985, Ramirez drove to Northridge and broke into the home of 30-year-old Chris Peterson and Virginia Peterson, aged 27. He crept into the bedroom, startling Virginia, and shot her in the face with a .25 caliber semi-automatic handgun. He then shot Chris in the neck and attempted to flee. Chris was clearly a fighter, something Ramirez did not expect, because he began to fight back. Ramirez fired 2 more shots at Chris, shots he avoided. Despite this, Ramirez did eventually manage to escape. Miraculously, the couple survived their injuries. Just 2 nights later, Ramirez drove a stolen car to Diamond Bar and chose the home of Sakina Aberworth, aged 27, and her husband 31-year-old Elias Aberworth. Sometime around 2:30 a.m, he entered the home and went into the master bedroom. Sadly, he instantly killed the sleeping Elias with a shot to the head with a .25 caliber handgun. He then handcuffed and beat Sakina whilst forcing her to reveal the locations of the family jewellery. He then brutally raped her. He reportedly demanded that she swear on Satan that she would not scream during the assaults. During the attack, the couple's 3-year-old son entered the bedroom. Ramirez proceeded to tie the child up and then continued to rape Sakina. After he left the house, Sakina untied her son and sent him to the neighbours for help. Ramirez, who had been closely following news coverage of his crimes, left Los Angeles and headed to San Francisco. On August 18th, he entered the home of 66-year-old Peter Pan and 62-year-old Barbara Pan. He shot the sleeping Peter in the temple with a .25 caliber handgun and sadly killed him instantly. He then beat and sexually assaulted Barbara before shooting her in the head and leaving her for dead. At the crime scene, Ramirez used lipstick to scrawl a pentagram and the phrase, "Jack the Knife," on the bedroom wall. He again left a shoe print at the scene of the crime, the detective discovered it and matched it to a specific pair of Avia shoes that were not common at the time. Lead detectives Frank Solano and Gil Carrillo contacted the manufacturer of the shoes and were able to retrieve the soles. Upon the discovery of the make and distribution across the United States, only 6 of them existed in a men's 11.5, with 5 of them shipped to locations in Arizona, and only 1 shipped to LA. It was evident that this one pair in this size and this kind in the state of California belonged to the perpetrator. When it was discovered that the ballistics and shoe print evidence from the Los Angeles crime scenes matched the Pan crime scene, San Francisco's then mayor Dianne Feldstein divulged the information, including the gun's caliber, in a televised press conference. This was a bad move on her part. This leak infuriated the detectives, as they knew the killer would be following the news coverage, which gave him the opportunity to destroy crucial forensic evidence. As expected, Ramirez had indeed been watching, and dropped his sneakers off the side of the Golden Gate Bridge that night. He remained in the area for a few more days before heading back to the LA area. On August 24, 1985, Ramirez travelled 76 miles south of Los Angeles in a stolen orange Toyota. That night, he arrived in the home of 45-year-old James Ramirez Jr., who had returned from a family vacation in Mexico. Ramirez's son, 13-year-old James Ramirez III, happened to be awake, while the rest of his family were asleep. James went outside of his home to retrieve a pillow that was inside the truck, which was locked. When he was outside, he heard a rustling noise. Naturally assuming it was an animal, James went to investigate, but did not notice anything out of the ordinary. James then went into his garage and began working on his mini bike, before hearing Ramirez's footsteps outside the house. Thinking there was a prowler, James, after observing Ramirez through his bedroom window, bravely went to wake his parents, and Ramirez fled the scene. James ran outside and noted the colour, make and style of the car, as well as a partial license plate number. Ramirez contacted the police with this information, believing James had chased away a thief. If only he knew at that time what he had actually done was chased away a serial killer. I think it's safe to say that family is incredibly lucky that their 13-year-old son was awake. With his attack on the Romero residence aborted, Ramirez broke into the home of 30-year-old Bill Carnes and his fiancée, 29-year-old Inez Erickson, through a back door. Ramirez entered the sleeping couple's bedroom and awakened Carnes when he cocked his .25 caliber handgun. He shot Carnes 3 times in the head before turning his attention to Erickson. Ramirez identified himself as the Night Stalker and forced her to swear that she loved Satan as he beat her with his fists and bound her with neckties from the closet. After stealing what he could find, Ramirez dragged Erickson to another room before he began to brutally rape her. He then demanded cash and jewellery and made her swear on Satan that there was no more. Before leaving the home, he told Erickson, "Tell them the Night Stalker was here." Erickson untied herself and went to a neighbour's house for help. Upon the paramedics' arrival at the scene, they discovered that Carnes was still alive. They rushed him to the hospital, and surgeons removed 2 of the 3 bullets from his head. Miraculously, he survived his injuries. During his killing spree, a woman named Patty Elaine Higgins, aged 32 in Arcadia, was killed. She was sodomized, strangled, and her throat was slashed. Ramirez was initially charged with this murder, but unfortunately the charges were later dropped because there was not enough evidence to link Ramirez to the crimes. Perhaps one of Ramirez's biggest mistakes was allowing Erickson to live, because she was able to give a very detailed description of her assailant to the investigators. The police obtained a cast of Ramirez's footprint from the Romero house. The stolen Toyota was found abandoned on August 28th in Koreatown, Los Angeles, and police obtained a single fingerprint from the rearview mirror despite Ramirez's careful efforts to wipe the car clean from his prints. This print would be his demise. The print was positively identified as belonging to Ramirez, who was described by police as a 25-year-old drifter from Texas, with a long rap sheet that included many arrests for traffic and illegal drug violations. The identification of Ramirez's prints was described as a near miracle, as the system used to identify him was recently installed, as well as the fact that the system contained the fingerprints of criminals born after January 1st of 1960, only a month before Ramirez was born. How incredibly lucky. On August 29, 1985, law enforcement officials decided to release a mugshot of Ramirez. The mugshot was from a 1984 arrest for auto theft. At the police press conference, it was announced, "We know who you are now, and soon everybody else will. There'll be no place you can hide." And my God, was this true. On August 30th of 1985, Ramirez took a bus to Tucson, Arizona to visit his brother. Unaware that he'd be in the lead story in virtually every major newspaper and television news program across California. After failing to meet his brother due to him not being home, he returned to LA early in the morning on August 31st. He walked past police officers who were stalking the bus terminals in hopes of catching the killer should he attempt to flee on an outbound bus, and in a convenience store in East LA. After noticing a group of elderly Hispanic women fearfully identifying him as El Matador, Ramirez saw his face on the front page of a newspaper. Seeing this, he fled the store in a panic. He began running across the Santa Ana freeway and attempted to carjack an unlocked Ford Mustang. He was pulled back by two angry residents. Ramirez would then proceed to run across the street and attempted to take the keys from another lady. Her husband happened to be close by and witnessed the attack and struck Ramirez over the head with a fence post in the pursuit. In the end, a group of over 10 residents formed and chased Ramirez down Hubbard Street in Boyle Heights. They soon restrained Ramirez and relentlessly beat him. At around 8 a.m, police were called over a disturbance in the area, with few details which indications of a fight. Police quickly arrived on Hubbard Street and took severely beaten Ramirez into custody. For Ramirez, trial began on July 22nd of 1988. At his first court appearance, he raised his hand with a pentagram on it and yelled, "Hail Satan." On August 3rd of 1988, the Los Angeles Times reported that some jail employees overheard Ramirez planning to shoot the prosecutor with a gun, which he intended to have smuggled into the courtroom. Consequently, a metal detector was installed and intensive searches were conducted on people entering. On August 14th, the trial was interrupted because one of the jurors, Phyllis Singletray, did not arrive at the courtroom. Later that day, she was sadly found shot dead in her apartment. The jury, understandably, were terrified, wondering if Ramirez had somehow directed this event from inside his prison cell, and whether or not he could reach other jurors. However, it was ultimately determined that Ramirez was not responsible for Singletray's death, as she was sadly shot and killed by her boyfriend, who later committed suicide with the same weapon in a hotel. The alternate juror who replaced Singletray was too frightened to return to her home. On September 20th of 1989, Ramirez was convicted of all 43 charges, 13 counts of murder, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. During the penalty phase of the trial on November 7th of 1989, he was sentenced to death in California's gas chamber. He stated to reporters after the death sentence, "Big deal. Death always went with the territory. See you in Disneyland." Overall, the trial cost $1.8 million. While awaiting trial, Ramirez reportedly met actor Sean Penn. Penn, who'd been jailed for 33 days in 1987 for reckless driving and assault on an extra on Colors, the 1988 movie, claimed to receive a letter from Ramirez as a fellow inmate. Penn wrote back to Ramirez, reportedly telling him he had no sympathy and hoped he died in the gas chamber. A pretty baller move from Penn, if you ask me. By the time of the trial, Ramirez had fans who were writing him letters and paying him visits. I will never ever understand people who fantasize about being with these killers. Beginning in 1985, Doreen Loy wrote Ramirez nearly 75 letters during his incarceration, and in 1988 he proposed to Loy. On October 3rd of 1996, they were married in the California San Quentin State Prison. For many years before Ramirez's death, Loy stated that she would commit suicide when Ramirez was executed. Clearly a very good example of what happens when people are brainwashed by monsters. By the time of his death in 2013, Ramirez was engaged to a 23-year-old writer. On August 7th of 2006, Ramirez's first round of state appeals ended unsuccessfully when the California Supreme Court upheld his convictions of the death sentence, as they should have. On September 7th of 2006, the California Supreme Court denied his request for a rehearing because he did not deserve it. Ramirez apparently had additional appeals pending up until the time of his death. Ramirez would not die in the gas chamber, however, because he died of complications secondary to B-cell lymphoma at Marion General Hospital in California on July 7th of 2013. He was also affected by chronic substance abuse and chronic hepatitis C viral infections. This is the story of the Night Stalker Richard Ramirez. He is a man whom I believe was truly born evil, and I don't say that lightly. My heart goes to the family and friends of the victims and those who survived their encounters with this monster. Anyway, I hope you liked this video, and if you do, then please leave a like and subscribe. It would help me out a lot. And if you have any cases that you would like me to do in the future, please leave a comment down below. I'd love to hear about them. Anyway, that is it from me. I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye for now.